everyone. Welcome to our third Three Smart Guys podcast, sponsored by Directions on Microsoft, your authoritative source of all things Microsoft enterprise software, cost management, and licensing. If you want to optimize your Microsoft footprint, come to us at directionsonmicrosoft.com. So I'm Barry Briggs. Hello. There's Peter O'Kelly over in my top right on my screen, and George Gilbert. Wave, George. And together we've got something like over a century, and I think the majority of that century is on me, of hard-earned experience in enterprise computing. And we are all veterans of the desktop computing collaboration wars. Some of you with gray hair remember that back in the 90s and the 2000s. I personally spent 5 years or thereabouts as the lead developer on Lotus 123, which if anybody remembers it now, they remember it as, wasn't there something before Excel? Anyway, the desktop wars were, as we all know by now, decisively won by Microsoft probably about 20, 25 years ago. The only real challenger today is Google Workspace, and I looked up just before this call, and they have somewhere over 20%, and they are growing in terms of enterprise market share. So something we'll talk about in the course of our conversation. But what I want to start with is the notion of word processing, presentation graphics, and spreadsheet. PowerPoint, Word, and Excel. We have come to the point where we have taken those for granted. They are the archetypes of communication for us today. Maybe before that were books started by Gutenberg. Before that were chiseled walls. Before that, the oral tradition, illuminated manuscripts, and so on. But today it's Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. And they've really gotten to be a point where I'd say we just take them for granted. They're just there. Now, if you're a CFO, they're not just there. Because if you're a CFO, you didn't forget them, because Microsoft frequently and maybe even capriciously raises prices and changes the licensing terms very frequently over time, over and over. But I think most C-levels in IT would recognize that Office has become infrastructure. It's COGS. It's the cost of doing business. You negotiated with Microsoft, but in the end, you paid. But, I want to hear from you guys. Personally, these days, I live in Claude and in Gemini. I even know senior Microsoft people, I was talking to one earlier in the week, who say they start their day not in Office, but in Copilot. So my question for you guys is, are we at an inflection point? Is Office in trouble? Is it gulp? Is Office dying?
From my perspective, I think to your comment on the last 25, 30 years, I think that Microsoft Office, and again, let's just say Office, aka Microsoft 365, until we get to the platform dimensions of it. I think it's facing its biggest competitive challenges since it vanquished Smart Suite and WordPerfect and the other early productivity app vendors. There's no question it's been an astonishingly profitable product line for a long time. And as you alluded to, they still have dominant share in the most profitable part of the market. But I think there are a couple things going on. One, I think in terms of overall seats, there are lots of reports that say actually Google Workspace has surpassed Office. Again, maybe not in the parts where everybody's paying for it, like education, individual users, small, medium-sized businesses and everything. So I think that threat never really went away. But I think in the bigger picture, as you also kind of suggested, we're shifting now. We're shifting from artifacts to activities. And there's all the talk about agentic and things related to that. But I think increasingly people are saying, I don't want to go launch this tool or this application. I want to get things done. And I think that is going to present a big challenge to the traditional Office applications. So incorporating AI is another thing. And we talked a little bit before in a previous episode about how that could potentially relegate the Office apps to a smaller role, because what's going to be the center of the user experience for that activity focused thing. So yeah, I do think that there's revitalized competition in this space. I think ultimately it's going to be very good for Microsoft customers, for the industry overall, and it'll be interesting to see how effectively Microsoft can leverage its resources to take things to the next level.
Yeah, pick up on that. Just very brief. Peter, when you talk about, on the one hand, the Google products have maybe surpassed it in unit share, if not revenue share, like, and you're talking about like tools to activities, like we sort of got a preview of this when Slack emerged and we had this sort of new work surface, and then Microsoft responded because it wasn't a business model shift. It was just, okay, we'll add Teams, and the bigger issue I think now is we're seeing there's a potential business model shift, like where you see a hint of it in Cowork from Claude, which Microsoft did their own version of, but the problem is Cowork gives you just a conversational interface, but if there's an editing surface in there, and then Cowork can drive the Office components with open source libraries on the open file formats, then they can work with the Office apps essentially without an Office license. That's the business model challenge. And a user would still need the Office apps for now to interact with these artifacts that a Cowork type engine might, or agent might create. But you could see in this editable surface, like a future version of MCP that already has a user interface. You could see someone building lightweight components that read and write these file formats that the user would interact with. And then you really have gotten around, you've moved the apps to the periphery, then you've created alternative to the apps, you have your own container, and so it's a business model and a technology shift if you get that far.
Yeah, I will say, I just want to say, as an anecdotally, there's a lot of, we're talking about a lot of visionary stuff that's, years down the road. I was using Claude yesterday to help me build a slide, a PowerPoint slide, and sure enough, it built me a PowerPoint slide, and it was great. But what I discovered was its implementation of PowerPoint or its usage of PowerPoint was terrible. So I wanted it to draw an arrow between two boxes. Didn't draw an arrow. It drew a rectangle, filled in the rectangle, and then put a triangle at the end of that and filled in So when I went to adjust the arrow, none of the stuff aligned. So we'll get there, right? But we're not there yet.
And George, just to make sure I'm on the same page with you there, because there were a lot of different technologies and abbreviations that you ran through kind of quickly there. The best case scenario for Microsoft in the world that you just described is if Copilot Pages becomes the center of activity, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I was talking about the Claude version, and back-ended perhaps by Glean instead of the Microsoft Graph, for companies that have a lot of non-Microsoft information they want to organize.
Yeah.
I mean,
I saw an interesting article this morning. Actually, it was from some guys at Perplexity saying that they hated MCP actually because, and my view is they were using it wrong, but they didn't like MCP because it was no substitute for just raw APIs. And they said, and I think there's a tendency among developers to think, oh, I should use MCP instead of an API, but there's clear and obvious use cases for both. I mean, if you want fine-grained access to an application, you use an API. If you just want to know, hey, what do you know about this particular topic? And MCP is a pretty good choice. Now, if you look at, I'll just say one more thing about that. If you look at SharePoint's MCP server, for example, it's got maybe 50, 60 tools in it, which very fine grained, and frankly, if you're going to go to that level, you should probably go at the API level.
And I think for both of those things you have just said, this is not the primary target audience for the next generation of productivity applications. I think if you go to somebody who is comfortable in Excel and PowerPoint and Word and say, hey, I got this cool new thing called MCP, which is better than an API, they're going to say, when are we eating lunch? Like, I don't want to know that.
But I'm talking about like MCP. Yes, I'm looking sort of down the road where I think Anthropic is trying to turn MCP into something that's not just a shim that abstracts an API, but they want to make it, I think, a component model. That's my impression, and that has a UI.
It's very believable.
Yeah, that they become the new container.
But MCP is not prominent in that anymore. You know, that's just an extension or a mechanism for integrating with other tools. The focus needs to be on the other tools, not the enabling technology.
Yes, fair.
You know, I mentioned CFOs at the top of the podcast, and you know, I think both of you noticed that Microsoft announced Microsoft 365 E7. You know, where E7 has Copilot and Agent 365 built into it for the low price of $99 per user per month. And you know, I think nobody believes that they're actually going to have to pay $99, you know, per seat per month, you know, in this. But that having been said, what do you guys think of that? I mean, I'll tell you my view. My view is it feels like, you know, they're flailing a little bit and they're trying to extract that last little, you know, 10% of the revenue market or the revenue space that's out there. And I'm not sure they're going to get it. I'm not sure they're going to get it.
Well,
any thoughts?
Let me just comment on that, because there's a big difference between your advertised price and your realized price. And we know, like, it's one of those lessons of software history that it's very hard to raise a price for a SKU over time. It's much harder to start with a declared price that you know, on sort of unofficially discount heavily, but as you add value to it, you can, you know, move back to your list price. It's a difficult way of saying, like, Microsoft heavily discounted Azure when they were trying to attract new customers. And then when the customers renewed and they expected the new discounted price, that Microsoft was like, well, no, because you're on the platform now. And I mean, that's just one way of looking at it. I'm not disputing that they're, you know, that they're flailing a little bit, but I think their thinking, I would imagine, is that they're going to add a lot more value at this SKU level, and they want a price point that is a bucket for all that.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple goals that might be, in some respects, at odds. One of them is maximizing profit, as you said, but another one is they need to get every enterprise as deeply entrenched with the whole collection of Microsoft 365 services as soon as possible, because of, among other things, like we were talking about, if there's a chance that Word and Excel and PowerPoint are going to get relegated to more like viewer, editor, component roles, then the importance of going out and getting everybody committed to the full collection of services behind it. It starts to sound a little bit in the extreme like IBM with FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, where it's like, hey, you know, it would be a real shame if AI sort of burned your house down because you didn't have sufficient controls in it. And the only way to get sufficient controls is to go with the whole suite here. And I think the last minute addition there, in conjunction with the E7 launch of the Anthropic partnership based Microsoft Copilot co-work, is kind of telling that maybe they're looking for additional compelling things to add to this to get people over the $99.
You know, one of the things that confused me a little bit was my colleague, one of my colleagues, Lane Shelton, says that they're putting both platform and features into this E7 thing, and in particular, Agent 365, which is a control plane for agents, right? And to me, I would have thought that the control plane for agents, which is effectively, the Entra ID level, manager of who your agents are, managing the identity of all your agents and what they're allowed to do and role-based permissions and all that, should go as part of the cheapest possible tier of Microsoft 365, so that no matter what, your agents are always under control, no matter how you deploy them and on what tier you deploy them. And yet they put it in the most expensive tier, which I just found that very surprising.
Well, I got to assume that their ambition is just like with Apple Just Works services, that everybody should just sign up for everything because it's the easiest, despite the historical challenges getting everybody to get to E5. I think their ambition has to be to get everybody on E7. So
Yeah.
I think they're taking the shot saying this is, you need all of this. And when you realize you need all of it, it is cheaper to buy it with one E7 seat than it is to buy 5 or 6 separate services.
I have to say that the whole thing reminded me a bit of the directory wars. You guys remember those,
Yeah.
the notes, name, and address book, and Novell, and Active Directory, and so forth. And I think the big lesson coming out of that is, if you own the enterprise identity, the enterprise directory, you own the enterprise. I mean,
Yes.
It's kind of a full stop. It's so deeply entrenched. So to me, again, making these kind of identity level things as entrenched as possible in the enterprise seems like that would be the goal. But
just elaborate for those of us who, either didn't live through it or only have a vague memory of why that's the central leverage point. Is that because everything becomes an adjacency if you own the
Yeah.
security, for
Yeah.
for accessing a service?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real challenge the real realization that Microsoft had in those early days was that Active Directory was infrastructure. We thought of Notes as an application, right? And the Notes, name, and address book was part of that application, but that led to all sorts of clunky things like having to build directory synchronization between the two and all that kind of stuff. And it was just so much easier for people to say, if you have Active Directory, using Exchange is a no-brainer.
But correct me if I'm misremembering, didn't Active Directory essentially get spawned out of Exchange? I mean, it wasn't a standalone service at the outset, right? It kind of came along with Exchange.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're really forcing me to go back into some rarely traveled caverns of memory.
I know
But
I've
they
got my
were-
LAN manager stuff around here somewhere.
They were, but Microsoft was originally trying to build a standalone directory before Exchange, and I think that was the part of Cairo. But since they couldn't build Cairo, they needed a standalone directory, and they took it out of Exchange. In other words, you're right. Yes, they knew that was central infrastructure for everything, but it took them 2 tries to get it right.
Let's circle back to the present.
Yeah.
This is fun. And for our listeners, we do this a lot because we've all been around the industry for a long time. Let me just say, what is in the news this week is Mustafa Suleyman. And if you've followed his career, at Inflection and Google, and then 2 years ago, became one of the CEOs, and I'll just, in parentheses, I track all of the Microsoft officers, and it's just a list that just keeps growing and growing and growing. I forget how many CEOs they have, but they have a lot of them. Mustafa was the CEO, or I guess he still is the CEO of Microsoft AI, but he seems to have had his responsibilities significantly reduced. I mean, what do you guys make of that?
I think there are a couple. I think the combination of the Satya Nadella and Mustafa Suleyman memos that were published by Microsoft are really good case studies in corporate choreography. So it's like, yeah, this is all net positive, and we did it on purpose. It's probably been in the plans for a long time. But I agree with you that it sort of stands out when you say, your job's just been, cut in half or more in terms of the overall responsibilities he has. Now, it is possible and probable that being responsible for super intelligence and the frontier model from Microsoft is an all-consuming job. So perhaps Suleiman did in fact say, no, I don't want to do this other product team cajoling stuff anymore. But yeah, I think it's a pretty big milestone and a surprise. So two years ago today was the announcement of the acqui-hire from Inflection, as you mentioned. So yeah, I think this is something to watch. It's going to be a leading indicator one way or another.
So let me take a different take or give a different take on this. Like, no question that he's lost some product responsibility and he's focused now on the models. But I wouldn't interpret this as meaning that the model effort sort of is flailing, because if you go back and you listen to what Nadella said on the BG2 podcast the first time he was on, it was really interesting. He talks about how distillation is like piracy. He's like, once features come out in a model, it's easy to kind of copy the behavior, relatively easy. And he's like, know-how kind of moves through the industry and with hires from vendor to vendor. And I don't think he came out and said explicitly, but what I inferred was something that Gates used to say about Windows and Macintosh, which was, it's fine to have someone at the frontier, and it's fine to have someone who's a year behind it, and that's going to be the mainstream of the market share. In other words, in a world where you're going to have multiple models building all your in all your systems, you don't need to have the frontier. You're not going to only have a frontier model. You're going to have models that are cheaper, faster, specialized. And I think what they're saying is, and they don't want to say this because it hurts the brand, but they don't need to be at the frontier. They just need something that's 6 to 12 months behind so that their cost of goods is zero. The marginal cost of adding that intelligence is zero. They'll pay for the frontier intelligence where they need it, but they need something less for most use cases or for the complementary intelligence.
Oh, I think that's a bet the company kind of proposition at this point. And, they are saying that their ability to flexibly work with multiple models is a feature instead of a bug. I think if you work at Google and you look at like integration from the data center and the TPUs all the way up into workspace, and you say maybe, some would argue that the race is really down to two players between Anthropic and Google. Anthropic, which Microsoft has an investment in and just did a product partnership with for Copilot Cowork. So I think it's a plausible bet, but if the bet's wrong, then they're going to spend a phenomenal amount of money and end up struggling to remain, look at Meta as a leading indicator there for how to waste tens of billions of dollars and then say, oops, it didn't work the way we hoped.
Yeah, but I think George has a point, which is that, Microsoft has historically been successful being a fast follower, right? And so, maybe what they said is, hey, it's too hard being on the leading edge, and it's too risky being on the leading edge. And to George's point, maybe 6 to 12 months behind the leading frontier models is just fine. That's all I need for Copilot. And I want to come back to Copilot in just a second, but maybe that's all we need.
Yeah, but I mean, that gets back to the theme of the Microsoft good enough moat. And the good enough moat is not for them to determine, it's for their customers to determine. And if there's open competition and others are adding interesting features like Notebook LM or whatever, Nano Banana, other stuff, Microsoft.
Peter, I'm saying something slightly different. I'm saying any system is going to have a constellation of models in it, one of which is a frontier model. And other models are on the performance and cost elsewhere on the performance and cost curve. And then there might be some fine-tuned models where the frontier models, you might not have a license to, do RL training on them.
Right.
And I'm saying they want to get those other ones, and they'll license, or pay full freight for the frontier model.
So I think these are separable issues. One is that, neural symbolic and the rest of it, there will be multiple model types. The other issue is there a commoditization of frontier models, which are infinitely expensive and move very quickly? And I'm saying if they bet wrong on the second one, they have a problem precisely because their arch competitor, going back to the productivity application space, as well as in the cloud space increasingly, is Google. And Google happens to have one of those leading frontier models. And at least at this point, Microsoft does not, which takes us back to maybe that's why
But wait, Peter, no, then I'm not being clear. I'm saying they don't need to build one of the frontier ones. All they need is access to.
No, I hear you, and I'm saying I'm disagreeing with you. I think that if one of your competitors is building it and can fully integrate it at the deepest level across their product lines, and that matters to customers for differentiating features, then being able to say we're multi-model and we can work with whoever you want is sort of like their database platform approach, saying you want Mongo.
Okay,
Let me jump in here. I want to switch gears. I want to talk about Copilot, everybody's favorite topic. And how I think about it is, and this gets back to our conversation about, is Microsoft, fast follower, or are they a first mover? And it seemed like for a while they were a first mover, right? I mean, on November 30th, 2022, ChatGPT was announced, and within a couple of months, Microsoft had made this big deal with OpenAI, and Satya Nadella had even saved Sam Altman's job, and it looked like Google was confused, and AWS was and is flailing a bit, and Meta is wherever Meta is. But I think you're right, Peter. It's coming down to a two-horse race, and is I guess here's the question, though. I mean, if we're talking about Copilot, which is what is the right user interface model here? What Microsoft has done is, I'm going to be somewhat harsh and say they bolted AI onto their existing applications with Copilot. You still have Word, you still have PowerPoint, you still have Excel. We bolted them on. They had to teach the Copilots all about the internals of each of those applications and so on. That's what they did. Alternatively, if you look at an application like Notebook LM, for example, from Google, you don't start with any of the tools. You just say, here's what I want to do. You gather up all the information, and then based on whoever your target audience is, you can build a spreadsheet, you can build a PowerPoint, and the presentation metaphor becomes kind of an afterthought. It's really about the research and the report creation piece of this, and the output part of that is sort of the last step, rather than being intricately interwoven with the task. I mean, which do you agree with that analysis, and do you think that which one's going to win?
So I think we're partway along in this. So I think most people today, when they think about Copilot or they think about Gemini in Workspace, they're thinking, help me use this artifact generating application better. They're not thinking today, like, there's some compelling demos that say, hey, go prepare for my management meeting, or, help me catch up to all the things I missed and so on. And that's more, building on the underlying graphs and so on. But I think today it's more about help me generate artifacts than it is about help me do activities that are beyond that scope. So I think we're still very much in early days. I agree with you, however, that it looked like initially it was let's bolt AI as a feature onto everything, instead of standing back and saying, how could we reimagine productivity and maybe accelerate this shift from artifact centricity to actually doing activities that are not one-to-one mapped to artifacts. I think if they had a first mover advantage there, they blew it, because Copilot does not have impressive market share, and there are reports that even Nadella said back to his product team, this just doesn't work. So let's go back to the drawing board.
Interestingly enough, I was using it this morning, in preparation for this pod today. and I was using it to write a document. And yesterday, as I was using it, I thought, hey, you know, this is pretty good. It was actually writing the Word document exactly the way I wanted it, exactly the tone I wanted it. And this morning, I went to pick up the work that I was doing, and Copilot was down. So I don't know. That's just a data point of one, but I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
this when you're using Copilot, is there this task kind of frame that becomes the new container? Is that because that's what we're missing?
Yeah.
Or
that's right.
were you working in Copilot in Word or Copilot?
in Word and,
Oh.
and with Copilot pane off to the right.
Oh.
So what do you think? What do you think, George? I mean, do you think is offices days numbered, or are they numbered, or does it have or will Office absorb AI and retain that, retain being the primary metaphor, the primary archetype by which we create content?
I do think we'll see something that's more like a blend of Notebook LM, Glean to organize things on the back end, and something like CoWork with an editable surface, where I mean CoWork and Notebook LM almost like somehow to merge, because this idea that you have an information core and then it can be presented in any modality is really compelling. But I think what Notebook LM is missing is that give me the automation across, across all these artifacts. That's where CoWork would come in. But to bring it back to Office, I still think it's not going away anytime soon. The risk is they just get pushed more to the periphery and they become components, and then the components are easier to replace over time. That's I think the risk.
We are at time. Any closing comments before we wrap up?
One brief one, I promise I will keep it brief, that I think is going to be interesting in this is I do think that the combination of AI with productivity apps may also lead to a revitalization of the power user database tools, both because the AI capabilities will make it possible for more people to actually use those features, and also having done that and gotten like we were discussing in our last episode, getting your data house in order, now AI can do a whole lot more with it. But that's another one where Microsoft really needs to figure out how they're going to marshal and kind of consolidate their customer value proposition for that. But I think son of access.
Definitely a big task.
Yeah.
Anything else, George?
Nope.
Well, thank you all very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed our monthly podcast. And again, if you have questions about anything having to do with Microsoft, technology, pricing, cost management, licensing, come to directionsonmicrosoft.com. Thank you all very much.